Thank you for that very kind introduction, and I'm really pleased to be here, and thank you to everyone who has joined us today. Um, I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, I hope, and basically my core theme is going to be thinking about differences between theoretical approaches to what many regard as disruptive innovation in the digital space, and how that informs what I've called contested practice. So I'm going to compare and contrast what theories are informing many of the actions in the policy and digital governance sphere at the moment, and what is possible or likely to happen in practice. So those are going to be my two core themes. And I'm going to start with the theory. And do not worry, this is not about to be a lecture in economic theory. But there are just a couple of points I want to make about this slide. The first is that if one is well steeped and trained in neoclassical economics, the main thing that one focuses on in thinking about innovation and the way the innovation pathways are unfolding is to think about profit maximization and efficiency, to think about price competition and how effective it is, and whether or not markets are contestable. And in the digital space, notwithstanding the scale and scope economies that many of the largest players in the market are experiencing. And one thinks about intervening in the market if and only if a convincing evidence case can be made for market failure. But there are other ways of approaching the digital innovation paradigms that we see today from a number of different other theoretical vantage points. And one of those tends to go under the label of institutional theories. And there are economic institutional theories, but there are also political, sociological institutional theories, as well as historical, actually. And if one is coming to the issue of the digital innovation space and the drivers of it from those perspectives, instead of thinking principally about efficiency and profit maximization, one thinks about issues of social equity, cultural diversity, pluralism of content in the media, for example. It is taken as read that market dynamics are not very simple to model. They are very complex, and they are also very uncertain, and that quite often a case will be made for intervening in the digital market to reform the dynamics of that market in line with some set of public values. And then there's also another strand of theory which tends to go under the label of critical political economy. And here, asymmetrical power relations are even more to the fore, and the argument is generally that capitalist ideology is what influences individual preferences and demand in the digital space, and that it is the owners of the platforms of the high-tech firms who are intent on exploiting labor power to extract excess profits. And here, rather than necessarily reforming existing governance norms and rules, one focuses very much on what collective actions are needed in order to support new forms of ownership and alternatives. So those are three different ways of looking at digital innovation paradigms and trajectories. And I will argue that the neoclassical one is the one that is most dominant. And insofar as it has been most dominant in the last 10 years or even longer of the development and emergence of very large digital platforms, it has led to a situation in which self-regulation has been the kind of default. And this is aligned with a kind of neoclassical or neoliberal theoretical approach. And what that has meant is, as we all know, the main largely US, but also Chinese-owned digital platforms have been able to expand massively globally. They have been able to set their service agreements for users in a way that, from their point of view, maximizes their core asset value, which is, from their point of view, data. They have been able to lobby and delay all sorts of initiatives that in some countries and regions people have tentatively tried to apply to them to constrain their market power. They've also been very strategic in their application of standards, And one of the most critical things from the point of view of whether there is or is not competition in the market is whether data is portable or not. And they have tried to ensure that it is not, at least that it's limited or non-existent. They have also self-defined content moderation, and they have increasingly actually adopted ethical principles, but with relatively low transparency. So this is history in one sense. This is how we have got to where we are in terms of the development of the digital innovation paradigm that we see today, and it is very much aligned, as I said, with neoclassical economic theory. And so we have arrived in a space where enormous number of measures are being adopted by the EU, by its individual member states, by countries around the world, including Canada, Australia, and to some extent, and increasingly, the United States. And these are all measures which are being introduced into the digital innovation space with the aim of mitigating harms arising from artificial intelligence supported algorithms. And these measures are proliferating, and it's not my intention to go into each and every one of these now in this talk, but basically they address data protection and privacy. They address efforts to level the market playing field, in other words, to introduce more competition, to introduce some kind of oversight into content moderation, and to try to promote more effective ethical design and development of digital platforms and services. So some of these pieces of legislation are already in place, others are not. My intent today is not so much to talk about how the legislation comes into being, because I've already said it's largely motivated by a response to the historical emphasis on self-regulation. What I want to talk about today is the implementation side of these kinds of approaches to legislation and governance in this space. So if we think about how these different pieces of legislation, whether it be the Digital Services Act in Europe or the Digital Markets Act, or other pieces of legislation which are designed to, for example, support journalism in the face of declining revenues from advertising, there is, what I would suggest, is a whole set of contested practices. And they're contested because much of legislation assumes that when policy and regulation is implemented, it happens in a space which is largely informed by the neoclassical economic assumptions that I talked to you about, inflected by some other assumptions coming from the other theoretical positions. But quite often, if one reads the texts and looks at what is happening in the space of practice of the implementation of legislation, what one finds is four particularly noticeable sets of assumptions. The first is that informed rational choice will optimize social welfare. In other words, user preferences need to be taken as read in the market, that now or eventually we will have technological fixes to mitigate digital harms, that risk-based assessment of potential harms in the marketplace is or can be made transparent, and in addition that regulatory enforcement is effective. So I'm going to go through each one of these and think about it a little bit in terms of what it actually means. So in practice, what we find when we examine what is happening in the implementation phase of these regulatory initiatives regarding digital innovation is that there is a lingering assumption that comes very much from the neoclassical theoretical tradition that rational choice and contestable markets are actually achievable. And this goes along with a notion that there is a real possibility of choice for consumers and citizens, and that this is feasible if we can reach a stage where the markets are contestable. So in the European context, of course, this means that the 10,000 small entrepreneurial startup digital platforms, which are used by only a very few people, could actually have a space to grow because if it was more feasible to choose them, to switch to them, consumers would be rational and they would choose them if they had a better quality offer. It's also assumed, again, following the lingering assumption of neoclassical economics, that technological innovation will, in the long run, maximize individual and collective welfare, that this is the natural outcome. It may not happen today, it may not even happen in a year from now, but if we establish a reasoned set of parameters and constraints on the digital platforms and other tech companies, eventually their innovation capabilities will lead to the maximization of the social good. So that's the first aspect of practice, which seems to be pervasive, and I think we might want to question it. The second one is that technological fixes will mitigate digital harms, and these harms might include privacy, or they might include the harms associated with biases in monitoring practices, etc. So the assumption here, again, is strongly inflected by the neoclassical model, because it assumes that designed-in technological solutions will give users real choice. And the example I can give here is the emphasis that is being given to technology solutions that will empower the users, again, on the assumption that those users are in a position to be making real choices. My Data and the personal online data stores initiatives are all organized around the assumption that, given reasonably high levels of digital literacy across populations, people will indeed be able to make reasoned choices about how they engage online. There's also the deeply rooted assumption that the rating systems, I put social credit up there, but rating systems can either be limited and made to be fair in the way in which data is processed and monetized in order to segment consumer groups. We see in the EU case that the proposed AI Act, for example, bans the use of rating systems for certain purposes, but allows it for other purposes, that it is possible to, in the view of the Commission, to arrive at a situation whereby the constraints that are put on the platforms actually do lead to fair and equitable rating systems in sectors across the economy, from health to insurance to any other sector you care to think about. And finally, that privacy and safety can be achieved through the design of technological tools. Here, the presumption is that the rational consumer will have both the time and the motivation to find ways to use these systems in order to ensure that their data is used in the ways that they feel comfortable with. But of course, it also assumes that they will be able to make sense of and have sufficient information to be able to make those choices in a reasoned way. So again, in practice, the implementation of legislation has this strong emphasis on ideas that come and are informed largely by a neoliberal or neoclassical model. Thirdly, I think this is particularly interesting. There are enormous number of instances, if you read through legislation, and indeed if you interview those who are charged with implementing legislation in the digital space, that there is an idea that if we can get the legislation right in order to privilege a balance between economic value generation and the protection from harms, the mitigation of harms, that certainty is achievable, that somehow we will arrive at a point where all the stakeholders, from the consumers and citizens to the high-tech firms and governments, will be able to organize the digital space and the innovation space in a way that is much more certain than it is today. Secondly, that assessments of risk that justify when and how to intervene in the market can provide relatively conclusive guidance about what are the desirable regulatory actions and outcomes. In other words, for the protection of privacy or for the mitigation of the biases of monitoring and surveillance. Conclusive guidance in the sense that the evidence is objective, that it is gathered independently without being skewed in the interests of any of the stakeholders, and that there won't be parties in the way, so to speak, who will argue about either the underlying evidence supporting risk assessment or make claims about harms arising from digital innovation, which may or may not be grounded in an evidence base. But the assessment is, the view is very clearly in so many circles that conclusive guidance can be arrived at when we go about implementing this legislation. And lastly, that goes along with the belief that transparency in the way algorithms work, in the motivations of the different high-tech platforms, indeed in the motivations of other stakeholders, can be achieved through auditing processes and through information requests, and that change in the behavior of the platforms will arise through the credible threats of very large fines. Now, my suggestion isn't that there'll be no change. My suggestion is that if one has ever lived through proceedings which are contested in the antitrust space, or indeed in areas to do with content moderation, the idea that large tech companies and platforms will immediately reveal an uncontestable evidence base upon request from the European Commission or from a court is something which in so many ways beggars belief. The whole process of eliciting information that can provide auditability and transparency is itself contested. And yet the remarkable emphasis at the level of practice and implementation is always that if we can just get this legislation in place, we will see a big shift in our ability to monitor and audit not only the algorithms, but also the business dealings and business models of the high-tech firms. And fourthly, there's an underlying assumption, which is that regulatory enforcement is timely and that it is predictable, that it is not stalled by appeals or lobbying. I've put that slide up there just to remind us all just how much lobbying goes on. In other words, that there is a kind of a neoliberally informed notion that somehow regulatory implementation and enforcement will not be highly politicized, and that it will take place in a timely way, and that we won't have 10-year delays, for example, in appeals processes grinding on and on and on. There's also a notion that the companies not only are expected to, but can make their algorithms transparent. And in the case of the EU, for example, now there's not a deep transparency which is expected, but a transparency that would enable the ordinary user to make sense of what is going on in the terms of the manipulation of their data or social groups' data. And lastly, that in the process of implementation and practice, that technological innovation and economic growth ambitions are not being privileged over public values. The whole raison d'etre for introducing new regulations and governance into the digital space, at least in Europe, is to protect the public values of privacy, safety, security, etc., particularly with regard to children. The other aspect of these set of assumptions is that somehow it is predictable. After all, neoclassical economics engages in prediction, and given a relatively stable set of circumstances, it should be expected that it should be possible to predict how business models are going to unfold. But in practice, we already know that the world is complex, that markets are complicated, and that uncertainty prevails more often than certainty. And so therefore, the assumption that enforcement will actually be timely and predictable is not one that really can be relied upon. So what is the outcome of all of this, of these practices which are questionable? The outcome is really that regulatory practice is still strongly informed by neoclassical assumptions. Those assumptions are that market intervention leads to reliance on disputed risk metrics about digital technology harms, that somehow the disputes can be set on one side and there can be progress towards reaching the goals which are intended by the legislation. Secondly, that probabilistic evidence is so often being used to create a veneer of causality and certainty about the relationship between the business models of the platforms and the outcomes, leaving commercial datafication initiatives largely intact, not completely intact, but largely intact. And finally, the digital innovation paradigm, which is most predominant, which is the neoclassically inspired one, relies very much on a hope for improved AI prediction, artificial intelligence prediction machines, which ultimately will come to protect citizens' interests. So I'm coming to my last slide now. Finally, my basic message today is that there's not enough attention to regulation in practice. The paradigm which prevails and the regulatory responses are still very much inspired by neoclassical theory. What we need is a shift in paradigm that requires deeper scrutiny of digital regulation in practice, which also means, from a research point of view, far greater emphasis than is common now in establishing agencies which are capable of carrying out that scrutiny. Of course, some will say we don't have the data to carry out the scrutiny, but nevertheless, my argument is that we need to spend far more time paying attention to the empirical reality of regulatory practice to monitor what is happening in terms of the outcomes associated with the legislative measures which are being put in place. And that means that from a research point of view, we need to pay far more attention to institutional or political economy theories, which are capable of acknowledging the complexity of digital innovation paradigms, the uncertainty of these paradigms, and the persistence of asymmetrical power between the platforms and other stakeholders over time. Otherwise, my argument would be that many of the initiatives, the crescendo of regulatory interventions that are being put in place as I speak, and as continental Europeans will know, as well as what's happening in the UK, will make a difference, no doubt, in terms of the way in which some of the largest platforms operate. But it does not seem to me that it'll make a substantial difference insofar as it will not really shift the underlying ambitions of the platforms, which are to operate in the most efficient, profit maximizing manner. And I will stop there. I think that's about 30 minutes, so thank you.